Hello there. It's time for math again. Today we're going to do lesson 136, and we're going to talk about how to add and subtract unlike fractions. You're going to want to have pages 251 and 252 out and ready to go, and maybe even a piece of scrap paper to figure out some problems. Here's a problem that we've done before. Take a look at it and tell me, are the fractions in this addition problem like or unlike? What do you think? Well, if you remember, like fractions have the same number in the denominator. Unlike fractions have different numbers in the denominator. In this case, both of these fractions have a 9 in the denominator, so we can simply just add them together. We add the numerator together. 6 plus 2 is 8. And then we bring the 9 down, and the answer would be 8/9. So 6/9 plus 2/9 is equal to 8/9. But let's take a look at a problem like this. It takes 1/2 loaf of French bread to make a large sub sandwich, and 1/4 loaf to make a small sub sandwich. How much of the loaf is needed to make one sandwich of each size? Well, we want one large and one small. One large is 1/2 loaf, and one small is 1/4 loaf. So if we add those numbers together, 1/2 plus 1/4, except we have a little problem because these fractions are not like fractions. 1/2 has a 2 in the denominator, while 1/4 has a 4 in the denominator. So we can't just add the numerators together because the denominators are different. The size of the pieces is different. So how are we going to solve that? Well, first of all, it's probably easier if we write the problem vertically rather than horizontally. So we did that. And now we need to think. Remember we talked about equivalent fractions yesterday? And we talked about fractions being in higher terms or lower terms. What we really need to do is to make these fractions in like terms. And to do that, we have to think, okay, so how could I change 1/2 into an equivalent fraction that still means 1/2, but has a 4 in the denominator? And we did that in our last lesson. So remember, we can multiply by a name for 1. That's the identity principle. That's not going to change the value of 1/2, but it is going to change the terms. So if we multiply 1/2 by 2/2, a name for 1, then we get 2/4. And now we can add 2/4 plus 1/4, and we find the answer to our problem. It would take 3/4 of the loaf of bread to make a large sub sandwich and a small sub sandwich. Let's practice a couple more. Here we have 1/3 plus 2/6. Okay, so again we have unlike fractions. 1/3 has a 3 in the denominator. 2/6 has a 6 in the denominator. We need to get the denominators to be the same. And to do that, we need to multiply 1/3 by a name for 1 that will put 1/3 into higher terms, an equivalent fraction. It'll be still equal to 1/3, but it'll be in higher terms so that we can add 2/6 to it. And if you think about that, if we multiply 3 times 2, we get 6. So if we multiply by 2/2, we should get 2/6. And now we can add 2/6 plus 2/6 and get 4/6. You getting it? Catching on? Okay, well, let's try another one. Once again, we have two fractions that we're adding together, but they are in unlike terms. They have unlike terms. So we have to get them into like terms. In this case, because we're multiplying by a name for 1, we're going to look at the lower fraction, 2/5, because we can multiply 5 by something to get a 10. What number do we multiply by 5 to get 10? If you said 2, you were right. So let's multiply 2/5 by a name for 1, 2/2, and put the 2/5 into tenths. So now we would have 3/10 plus 4/10, and we can add it because now the fractions are in like terms, and we get 7/10. So now we've figured out how to add fractions when they are originally in unlike terms, how to put them into like terms, and then add them like we've already learned to do in the past. But what about subtraction? Here's a problem for us. 7/10 minus 4/10, and if we look carefully, we can see that these fractions have like terms. They both are measured in tenths. So we can take 7 minus 4, and that gives us 3. Bring down the 10. 3/10 is the answer. Very simple. But what happens if the terms are not like, or if they're unlike terms? Like in this one, 3/4 minus 2/8. Well, which fraction has lower terms? On the bottom, the top one does, doesn't it? 3/4 is in lower, fourths are lower terms than eighths, but we could put fourths into an equivalent fraction into eighths, and to do that we would multiply by a name for 1 using the identity principle of multiplication. If we multiply 3/4 times 2/2, we get 6/8, and now we can subtract 6/8 minus 2/8 is equal to 4/8. Okay, very similar to the addition, but we're just doing some subtraction now. Let's try another one. How about 1/2 minus 1/4? Again, the fractions are in unlike terms, so we have to put them into like terms before we can subtract them. And we're going to look at the one that's in halves, and we're going to try to rename it into fourths. We can do that by multiplying by a name for 1. If we multiply 1/2 times 2/2, we get 2/4. And then we can bring over the 1/4. And now we can subtract. 2/4 minus 1/4 is equal to 1/4. All right, let's look at another one. 1/3 minus 2/9. Maybe you want to pause the video and try this one on your own before you listen to the solution with me. Okay, are you back? I wonder what you got. Let's see if you got the same thing I got. Well, I see we have 1/3 minus 2/9. And I think that we can rename thirds as ninths if we multiply by a name for 1, 3/3. That would give us 3/9 minus 2/9 equals 1/9. So there you have it. We can add and subtract fractions if they are in unlike terms, if we put them into like terms first.